I want to respond to an interesting video that Rupert Spira made. It's a video entitled, "How Can Consciousness Have Multiple Experiences at Once?" And it's someone asking him this question, basically, the idea being, if consciousness is one, supposedly, as Rupert seems to suggest, then how is it possible that, there are multiple minds in it, basically, and they all seem to have different experiences? How is that possible, basically? And Rupert tries to answer this question via a few metaphors that I think are unfortunately ill-advised and don't really come to grips with the question. And they kind of show the problem with this form of explanation. Um, so I'll give you the metaphors he uses, and we'll examine them a little bit. So one of the metaphors he gives is the metaphor of an individual mind which experiences things uh, over time. Like, you seem to experience things now, you experienced things a moment ago, you experienced things yesterday. Um, well, each individual mind, which is presumably one consciousness, experiences things over time, different things over time. So how couldn't it be the case that uh, you know infinite consciousness couldn't experience multiple things simultaneously, right? So if we can imagine one mind experiencing different things over time, why can't consciousness experience multiple minds all at once? Well, this is a non sequitur, I think. It doesn't really add up because it's sort of a bit like saying, um, you know, we experience multiple things distributed in space, right? So, for example, the wall's over there, and there's a chair over there, right? There's a person over there. Um, so, if we experience different things in space, why can't infinite consciousness experience um, many things in all in the same place simultaneously? If we can experience different things that are distributed according to space, in our experience, why can't consciousness experience everything in one space? Well, because it's inconceivable how that would work. That's why, right? So we have our consciousness, which is a single consciousness, and it's the only kind of consciousness of which we're aware, in terms of subject-object experience. And to wonder how it is that something which is infinite consciousness how it could experience multiple minds, it isn't really helpful to suggest that just because we experience something distributed over time, it can therefore experience multiple things all at once. Because how would it? We have no experience of that. That's not a reasonable extrapolation. Then he brings up, I think, stuff like, well, what about a piano player who is playing two different melodies at the same time? But the melodies are assimilated into a single subjective experience. One subjective experience, not many different subjective experiences. So in other words, even though the two hands are playing quote-unquote two different melodies, they're actually effectively playing something which is a consolidation or an amalgamation of them both. It is someone from the outside who says, oh, those are two different melodies. Or maybe it's the pianist's intention to play two different melodies. But in fact, when he plays them at the same time, if they're two different melodies, now, in some sense, they're one grand melody. So there again, it's sort of consolidated into one thing, right? Rupert uses another example of, well, aren't you aware of the wall while you can hear sound? Can't you be aware of multiple things at once? Well, you can be aware of multiple things at once, but they're assimilated into a single subjective consciousness. Here we have the idea of, supposedly, of multiple subjective consciousnesses. multiple incompatible viewpoints, basically. There isn't a correspondence between having two things in the same viewpoint and having two completely incommensurable viewpoints, somehow experiencing them at the same time. The only way to understand that would be not using the concept of infinite consciousness, but the concept of God, which is different. Vedanta makes a very specific distinction between God, aka Ishvara, also called Ishvara, aka Saguna Brahman, which is, the entire universe in its full intelligent form. But it's still cut up into objects. And Nirguna Brahman, which is, the formless. Even saying formless is too much, because that's a kind of form you're giving it. The perspective from which God exists, what is God? God is that intelligence which is a single viewpoint which assimilates all the viewpoints. It is a being of sorts. That's what the concept of God is, right? God is not just a collection of stuff. God is an intelligent, omniscient being whose intelligence controls the universe. This concept of God is a limited relative concept, useful. But if understood in that sense, God is another name for the illusion. God is another name for mystery, we could say. If we want to have the idea of multiple viewpoints, then what Rupert is talking about adds up not to infinite consciousness, but to God. Nothing per se wrong with that. God is a very important provisional concept, and God in his or her or its true manifestation is nothing other than the formless. But the God which can see through multiple viewpoints at once is itself a kind of viewpoint. That's a viewpoint. It's a viewpoint which assimilates all the viewpoints, but it has to be its own subjective awareness. It has to be a kind of infinitely intelligent seer who sees through, which means it's a subject-object kind of experience, basically, which means it's God. It exists in some way as a kind of incredible meta person, If you could imagine a person, same sort of consciousness, except much more so, incredibly, omniscient, but still in some sense, still like there's an I in here and there's objects out there. So the objects are minds. So these metaphors aren't really adding up, right? Then he talks about the metaphor of a dream. He says, when we dream, we forget a lot of waking life, and we might assume the perspective of a dream character. The dream character has access only to certain select information that's then presented to the dream character as if it were real. Like Rupert uses the example of, a dream in London or something like that, and a character who thinks he's walking through the streets of London when in fact he's just walking through images that are conjured up by the mind. And the dreamer has voluntarily limited his information, and that limited information, the sort of standpoint of a certain amount of ignorance or forgetfulness results in a dream character. And so the idea being that this is how somehow infinite consciousness, the way infinite consciousness creates multiple viewpoints, it limits itself in these various ways. Well, the hidden assumption here is, yeah, there's a limitation that goes on, but, that limitation is not really managed by the conscious mind of a human dreamer. It's managed by something else. Something else manages both the human dreamer and the dream character that the human is imagining in the dream, that is the result of the forgetfulness. That something else, that couldn't exist if we're just imagining that infinite consciousness is doing exactly the same thing that a human is doing in generating dream minds. Because there's no one outside of infinite consciousness to manage that process. That process, right, that the forgetfulness, you can't actually forget if you're the one making yourself forget, Something else would have to make you forget, right? Otherwise, like trying to tickle yourself or trying to be a magician and trying to fool yourself. Right? You can't do that because how are you going to make yourself manage the process of forgetting, right? In humans it can happen because there's a conscious mind and there's an unconscious. The unconscious is managed by something else. We can call it biology, we can call it God, you can call it whatever you want, but it's something else relative to the conscious mind. But we're dealing with infinite consciousness, i.e. the capital S self, or Brahman, call it what you want. There's nothing outside of it. It is defined as that which does not have any limits, which is not bounded, which is one without a second. So there's nothing to manage that process of its forgetting. How can it make itself forget? It makes no sense. So these are all just metaphors, right? And you see is the problem with these metaphors. And then Rupert's like, well, yeah, but the materialist explanation is not as plausible, and so doesn't this explain more, And, the answer is, yeah, it might explain more, but that's not sufficient because it's still full of holes and it's at best a very provisional explanation. The real explanation lies in that God/Brahman distinction I mentioned earlier. There is a difference, and the difference is that Brahman is referring to some situation or the truth which is beyond the concepts of subject-object experience. You see, this question about multiple viewpoints arises only because there's a belief in one viewpoint. You currently believe you're experiencing subject-object duality. Therefore, the question then arises, well, are other people experiencing subject-object duality? And if so, how? How can we all be one and experiencing multiple things, I'll add in a couple of notes here. One is, trying to explain the mystery of multiple consciousnesses in terms of, well, we experience different things over time is really explaining one mystery in terms of another because we have no idea how time works. Time is a complete mystery. And so, so there's a real issue there in terms of believing that we are experiencing in the first place. That is what inquiry and surrender is really getting to, which is, well, are you experiencing the first place, right? Only because you think you're experiencing the first place do these questions arise. And then they become inexplicable mysteries, right? If we believe that we are experiencing, we put it in those terms, then we've bought into the scheme of language. And language is based on egoic thinking. which is that there's an I in here and there's stuff out there. Whether the out there is thoughts or feelings or trees or people, whatever it is, there's an implicit atomic self somewhere inside here, contrasted with other things. Thus language, thus questions like, which are put in language, of, well, how is it possible that I'm experiencing things and you're experiencing things and we're in some sense the same quote-unquote consciousness? Oh, and another note here, this is another reason, another thing along the lines of this God-Brahman distinction, which is advaita means not two. Is quite deliberately put that way. It's not put as, oneness. It is not two-ness, because it's pointing out this beyond concepts, beyond duality. It's not saying everything's unified, right? Rupert suggests at the end to his questioner, why don't you try imagining that everyone is, every object is you in some sense. I mean, admittedly, this is the way it's put in some of the scriptures, so I can't say that that's not in the scriptures. To some extent it is, but I do think it's a bit misleading, because it seems to suggest something that, again, comes to the notion of God. God is everything, right? But what would it mean for you to be everything? To live as if you were everything actually is, I would argue, meaningless. There's no. What could it possibly mean? What could it possibly mean? The only way to meaningfully understand that is not as you, as what you think you are, in some sense being everything, but that the very notion of there being separate things, and sort of juxtaposed to that, the other side of the coin, which is the idea of unity. Both unity and separation are wrong, right? Both unity and separation themselves, unity implies separation. Those concepts are problematic. And so similarly, the question of are there multiple consciousnesses, and if so, how, rests on the idea that there is your consciousness right now in the way that you think of it. But is there? The moment you actually deeply look into the I, via inquiry or surrender, the mind stops. And so the answer is given in silence, so to say. It's not that, oh, there are no appearances. It's not that, oh, there are appearances. It's not that there is an I or there isn't an I. That's not really the point. The point is, the whole question rests on a framework, a paradigm that is profoundly flawed, because it's in language, and language rests on a kind of illusion. Illusions are not completely non-existent. What they are can't be said, because the thing which you would use to talk about them is language, which is part of the illusion. So how does the illusion work? Where does it come from? Well, as soon as you ask those questions, you're already in the illusion. Those questions are caused by the illusion. They are resting on an illusory viewpoint. And if we accept that illusory viewpoint, fine, we can accept it. But then we are going to be locked into, in that case, eternal mystery, which is fine. It's right in the Rig Veda, oldest Hindu scripture, right? There's a meditation, a beautiful meditation on who the creator is. And it goes on and on. It gives this whole metaphor about, first there is, the void, and then out of that came desire, and then multiplicity, blah, 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 and it goes on and on. In the end, it says, well, who created all that? Really, who created everything? Really? And then it says, well, maybe the creator knows how it all came about, or maybe not even the creator knows. Right? So the moment you say, there is something, even saying those words, the moment you utter a word, you're now in language. And when you're in language, now you are locked into the realm of mystery, where the answer is going to be to all these existential questions. It's going to have to be literally, God only knows. But it's not simply not within our human capacity to know the answer. God knows. The other way of handling the question, and that first way is valid as far as it goes. It really is. It represents something important and undeniable in some sense. We can't deny that as soon as the mind thinks about it, it confronts mystery. And that mystery can never be resolved in thinking, right? As soon as you think, thinking entails that mystery. That mystery is thinking, drives thinking, generates thinking. Thinking, and mystery, these are linked, okay? But the other side of the coin is, look deeply into the one to whom the mystery seems to appear. And then there is a fullness, for lack of a better word, no matter what word I use, it's going to be a problem, right? Within which these mysteries are comprehended. They are comprehended. When I say comprehended, I don't mean intellectually comprehended. I mean comprehended in the sense of encompassed. There's something which wraps around them. Those mysteries occur within a sphere, and that sphere occurs within a space. Again, these are metaphors. They're not literal, right? And in that ultimate space, for lack of a better word, these existential questions don't bite in the same way, because there is a recognition they are part of the illusion. That the one who appears to be asking them is not what it appears to be. And it shows the real limitations of all philosophy and all metaphor. I've used, for example, in my own videos, ideas, which I do think represent some useful pointer kind of stuff, right, of recursion, right? There is a kind of recursiveness to the mind, right? The mind rests on the thought that it is, and that thought is kind of nested within another thought that says that it is, and that thought is nested within another thought, right? These thoughts of thoughts of thoughts of thoughts of thoughts. There's something to that. There's something to that. That can't literally be. That can't literally be the truth. Because that is an image. Images are a language, basically. And language is in the illusion. So the illusion can't literally work that way. Well, how does it literally work? That very question is in the illusion. So again, only two responses you can give. Either you have to say, well, I accept the question as it's posed, in which case God knows, but mortal minds cannot know because mortal minds are too limited. Or who's asking the question. You pursue that enough, and then there's a different kind of resolution. It isn't an answer in words. And we have to recognize the limitations of philosophy and metaphor in answering these questions. They cannot give true answers. They can, at most, provide some provisional fodder for the mind so it can go on the real quest and find its answers. Just enough to keep it going on the surrender or self-inquiry path. That's all